we will immediately go into the presentation. So, no belonging for believers. Today I will offer you a short introduction to Abdullahi's justification of the secular state and liberal citizenship from an explicitly Islamic perspective, and Talal Asad's severe critique of liberal citizenship as an exclusivist mechanism which is particularly hostile against Muslims in Europe. We will compare these two approaches to the secular state and citizenship, and we will finally do some reflections for possible future debates and, of course, our debate here today. The question of citizenship is, above all, a question of belonging, loyalty, solidarity, and participation, says Andrew March in his seminal study, Islam and Liberal Citizenship. If we replace citizenship by religion in this short quotation, we will immediately observe a crucial point of conflict between secular liberal states and religions. The question of religion is, above all, a question of belonging, loyalty, solidarity, and participation. So whom are, can, and should religious people be loyal to? And are citizens still believers? And vice versa. That's one of the questions both Ahmed and Asad deal with, but from very different perspectives, as I already told you. And both surround about the question, can Muslims as Muslims be citizens of the secular liberal state? Ahmed says, yes, clearly. And he justifies the secular state and liberal citizenship from a clearly Islamic and human rights perspective, while Talal Asad severely criticizes exactly this secular state and this definition of citizenship. Both within Islamic discourses and in discourses about Islam, as we observed the past few days, the question of citizenship and religious belonging are highly disputed. And we've got two main challenges. So non-Muslims in majority Muslim states, something we heard about in the morning and we will hear about later on, and Muslims in non-Muslim states, living there as a minority, especially in secular liberal states. From the perspective of liberal theory, religious affiliation shall be of no interest for the state as long as its citizens are loyal. From a classical Islamic perspective, the religious background of the people and the political leaders, however, are crucial. Andrew March again summarizes three main tensions between liberal theory and classical Islamic thought in regard to citizenship. First, the question of residence. Muslims must try to live under Islamic law and political authority. Second, the question of loyalty. Muslims must be loyal to Muslims and Muslim politics, maybe even exclusively. And third, Muslims are not requested to be solidary with non-Muslims. I mean, that's of course very ideal and very shortened now. Facing these severe challenges, reformist thinkers like Ahmed try to bring together the idea of liberal citizenship and Islamic thought. The aim is to overcome discriminatory concepts and practices in the Islamic tradition, particularly against non-Muslims, and to enable Muslims to fully participate in the civic political life of secular liberal democracies. So let's have a look at Ahmed's ideas. Abdullahi is a professor of law at Emory School of Law in Atlanta, and he had to flee Sudan, as many of you surely will know. And one of his main goals now is to justify the necessity of a secular state for Muslims in order to be able to live as Muslims, quotation, by conviction and free choice. For him, citizenship, constitutionalism, and human rights are the guiding principles of a reform of Islamic political thought. The notion of dhimma has to be overcome and turned into citizenship, the full membership in the political community. And now this citizenship is defined as follows: an affirmative belonging to an inclusive, pluralistic community that accepts and regulates the possibility of various forms of difference among persons and communities to ensure equal rights for all, without distinction on such grounds as religion, sex, ethnicity, and political opinion. Citizenship is a means to balance differences in a political community, and only with equal rights regardless of, inter alia, religious affiliation, discriminations can be avoided. Now, Anheim differentiates between three different dimensions of citizenship. The legal dimension, pointing to the legal framework which is necessary to create a minimum of trust based on the rule of law. The political dimension, which means the right to actively participate in the political process. And finally, cultural citizenship, the practice of actually, in his case, being American. We could also say being European or whatever. Anheim calls for a human rights-based version of citizenship and consequently rejects any versions of specifically Islamic concepts. Citizenship and human rights are closely connected. They enhance each other. Human rights define the concept of citizenship. They offer a framework. And citizenship allows Muslims and people of any other belonging or not religious belonging to stand up for human rights. Anheim rejects the term nation state and prefers territory state in order to overcome the reduction of citizenship to a question of nationality. Citizenship does not necessarily coincide with national belonging. It is the membership to a political community of a territorial state in its global context. However, there is the possibility for different belongings, including religious belonging, multiple belongings, which do not exclude the membership in a political community. Equal citizenship is necessary for everyone because it expresses equal human dignity and allows for full political participation. But what is the religious, philosophical, and moral foundation for a concept of citizenship that is consistent with human rights and can still be accepted from an Islamic perspective? For Anheim, it is the mutual recognition of the citizens as citizens, supported by the Islamic principle of reciprocity. This means treating each other with mutual respect and empathy. Only this reciprocity guarantees the moral, legal, and political implementation of citizen rights for everyone. For Anheim, it's clear that the traditional Dhimma system cannot be the basis for modern citizenship. However, it is still in certain ways influential. The Dhimma system, as you will surely know, offered the so-called people of the book property and security, freedom to practice religion in the private space, and a certain communal autonomy to govern internal affairs. However, people of the book had, for example, to pay the jizya. They were encouraged to convert, but not allowed to propagate their own faith or to display their own faith in public. And the public participation is restricted. And non-Muslims are excluded from public offices where they would rule over Muslims. Thus, for Anheim, there is definitely no equality between Muslims and people of the book, not to speak about members of other religious traditions or even atheists. Unbelievers who are considered to be no members of the community at all, apart from temporary conduct. Another crucial question: can concepts of constitutionalism, human rights, and citizenship that were mainly developed in European and American context be applied elsewhere? Anheim is very hopeful. He's aware of the difficulty of simply imposing citizenship as a strict and fixed concept. But there is the necessity for adaptations to local contexts. But these adaptations always have to be guided by three principles: civic reason, equality, and reciprocity. And Anheim is aware that there will be trial and error. However, the process of reform has to be started and will have to include three elements: overcoming the Dhimma system and implementing formal citizenship. Second, a methodologically and politically sound Islamic reform, which means that in constitutionalism, human rights and the concept of citizenship must be rooted in Islamic doctrine as well. And third, a serious indigenous dialogue in the Islamic societies about the secular state and its constitutive elements. Islam and the state must be separated institutionally, however Islam and politics may be entangled in the public debate. Individual citizens may bring Islamic ideas into the public debate as long as they are supported by civic reason and debated among all citizens, regardless of their religious belonging. We may summarize Naim's program as a call upon Muslims in this world, particularly he is writing for Muslims living in the US and Europe, a call upon Muslims to get involved, to become engaged and proactive citizens within the legal framework of the secular state and egalitarian citizenship. He wants to enhance the human rights discourse within the Islamic communities and justifies the secular state as the only political system that allows Muslims to freely choose to be Muslims and thus authentically practice their faith. Religious self-determination of the individual and the move beyond minority politics are only possible within the framework of citizenship and the secular state. Naim himself is a convinced Muslim and a convinced liberal theorist in the tradition of his teacher Mahmoud Taha and John Rawls. For him it's clear that believing and belonging are possible. Moreover, the concept of liberal citizenship as an overarching principle in the secular state allows for multiple practices, and that's important, practices of belongings and identities. Legal liberal citizenship is the framework for multiple practices of political and cultural citizenship. Thus, Naim can programmatically call upon Muslims in the US now to, quotation, contribute to the process of defining what it means to be American, and I may add, probably what it means to be European. Now, while Abdullahi Naim passionately supports the secular liberal state and citizenship, the New York-based anthropologist Talal Asad seriously challenges them. Believing and belonging are not possible for Muslims as Muslims within the framework of secular liberal democracy and its concept of citizenship, particularly not in Europe. Within his genealogies of the secular, its shadows and exclusivist violent practices, Asad develops a severe critique of the secular state and liberal citizenship from a post-colonial perspective. According to Asad, the secular state does not only aim at organizing religious plurality on a superficial level, but it aims at creating a new citizen by reshaping the self-understanding, the perception, and the courses of action of people. On the one hand, the state calls for a strict separation of public and private, particularly in the religious field. On the other hand, it wants to create citizens and thus deeply moves into the very private and personal spheres of people, including religious thought and concepts. The perfect citizen has thoroughly changed his concept of, quotation, reason, value, and reality in order to be a good citizen. For Asad, the secular liberal democracies in Europe do not offer appropriate spaces for Muslims as Muslims. This is not only due to a certain type of writing history, but it is rooted for Asad within the structures of secular liberal democracies as such. Particularly, religious plurality is made invisible. Muslims are not represented adequately as Muslims. And you see the quotation? Why is this the case? Because in theory, the citizens who constitute a democratic state belong to a class that is defined only by what is common to all its members and its members only. What is common is the abstract equality of individual citizens to one another, so that each counts as one. Citizens become abstract individuals. There must not be any religious particularity. It has to be extinguished and homogenized. Secular liberal citizenship, according to Asad, eradicates particularity, especially Muslim particularity, and thus there is no space for Muslims as Muslims in the secular liberal state. And he criticizes especially the demand for absolute loyalty to the state which is requested from Muslims. Jews, Catholics, and recent immigrants in a world of increasing migration all have loyalties that are not exhausted by the constitutional demands of the nation-state. Why should Muslims in Europe be expected to be different? So while Al-Naim focuses on the self-determination of the individual, Asad wants to strengthen the rights of the communities, not the individuals. In Asad's words, Muslims in Europe should be able to find institutional representation as a minority in a democratic state that consists only of minorities. Although the proposed alternative rests very vague within Asad's works, he points to a Europe of minorities where all the communities organize themselves as autonomous communities and find new coalitions at any time wherever necessary. Let's turn to a comparison between their conceptions. Both Asad and Al-Naim have spent the major part of their academic life as convinced Muslim intellectuals in the US, leaving their majority Muslim home countries either by force or by choice. Controversies about liberalism, the secular state, and the adequate space of Muslims within the framework of secular liberal democracies are an essential part of their work, but with very different approaches and ideas about them. While Al-Naim passionately supports the secular state and citizenship and tries to develop justifications for them from the perspective of Islamic law and human rights, Asad is deeply critical of the secular state's homogeneity and exclusivist violent attitudes, particularly against Muslims, as he says. Al-Naim has a clearly normative approach with an open political agenda. He wants equal citizenship as offered by the secular state, and this citizenship is the prerequisite for full participation in the political and cultural process for anybody. Muslims have to acknowledge and justify liberal citizenship from within their faith and in accordance with human rights. Constitutionalism, human rights, and citizenship create a space of deliberation which is open for anybody, regardless of religious affiliation, class, gender, etc. Asad, in contrast, does not fully reject democracy, not at all, but he emphasizes the exclusivist structures of the secular state and the homogenizing violence of liberal citizenship, targeted at religious people and Muslims in particular, who are not granted full participation as Muslims, only as abstract citizens. He rejects the normative violence of the secular liberal state, but he himself becomes normative in hidden ways, and that's a certain problem. While Al-Naim now fosters the right of the individual citizen for self-determination, including religious self-determination, Asad focuses on the lack of rights of religious communities within secular liberal states. If we want to be a little bit, if we want to sharpen the discussion a little, you could say secular individualism is the enemy of the grown communities for Asad. Talal Asad points to the weaknesses of the secular liberal states and liberal citizenship when confronted with religious pluralism. And I agree. He is right that there is a tendency to homogeneity and exclusivism, particularly with regard to religion and minorities. However, living together in plurality requires a basic agreement, a framework. But it will be crucial how much unity and how much loyalty the state requires and how citizenship actually is conceptualized and implemented. The core idea of liberal citizenship is that it should allow for full participation in the political process without discrimination based on class, gender, ethnicity, or religion. And history shows that this ideal has rarely been implemented, for example, by not granting women the right to vote. When criticizing liberal citizenship and the secular state, it is crucial to make two differentiations. We must distinguish between the ideal and its concrete, historical, social, etc. implementations. And second, we must distinguish with Abdullahi and Neuinger, and Gianluca Parolin has also mentioned that in his presentation. 3 elements of citizenship. We can have legal citizenship, political citizenship, and cultural citizenship. When Asad criticizes the secular state and citizenship per se, he does neither differentiate between ideal and reality, nor between the legal framework and its manifold political and cultural implementations in the various states. In contrast, Asad shows a tendency to favor separate, autonomous communities which would allow for making visible heterogeneity. And sometimes one wonders if he favors the dimmer system to the secular liberal state and citizenship, because it allows for more particularity and equality between the communities. It is a tendency one can observe in his writings, but it is a tendency that is taken up by groups that reject secular liberal democracy and citizenship per se. Assad's hidden normative image seems to be a coexistence in religious particularity, but no community, which would also require compromises and a common framework, which can then be justified in many different ways, as Abdullahi and Neuinger and other liberal theorists, especially Rawls, suggest. Let's think a little bit further. This is the most demanding aspect of being a Muslim in the West. How can one maintain one's sense in the Islamic truth and simultaneously acknowledge the truth of others? Thus summarizes Jocelyn Cesari by referring to Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, one of the most heatedly debated theological and political issues. And I would say it's not only a challenge for Islam, but for any religious community. However, if believing and belonging within the framework of liberal citizenship shall be possible, as Abdullahi Neuinger and many other Muslim theorists, like, for example, Fikret Karcic, suggest, this would require both sincere political and theological reforms. Equal legal citizenship, as offered by secular liberal democracy, is the basis for freedom and equality, irrespective of race, gender, ethnicity, or religion. But these claims have to be evaluated again and again. And in this regard, one has to listen carefully to critics like Talal Asad, but one must also be cautious not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Consequently, we sincerely have to ask, politically and theologically, how much loyalty can and must the secular liberal state demand from its religious citizens? To be a little more concrete, is wearing a niqab clearly a sign for rejecting the secular liberal state and thus a justification for denying legal citizenship? How much loyalty can religious people actually give to the state without surrendering their faith and without giving up the critical potential of religious thought towards the political and towards the also violent power of the secular liberal state? And to provoke us a little, why do we question the loyalty of religious people, and why do we hardly question the loyalty of hedge fund managers, international managers, or, for example, Mark Zuckerberg? Thank you very much for your attention.